Hey, remember John Klingberg's brief stint with the Leafs last season before a hip problem knocked him out for the year? Well, the big Swede could be coming back. To talk about that and more, here's our insider, Darren Dreger. Dregs, you broke some news today on Klingberg. Walk us through what the latest is on his situation.
Well, the latest is, Gino, this is a story of recovery, and we all recall how John Klingberg went through some difficult times post-Toronto Maple Leafs, of course. He had the hip resurfacing surgery in the fall of 2023. Now, for hockey fans familiar with this type of surgery, it's similar to what Patrick Kane had, what Jesse Puljujärvi had, and there is an extensive rehab and recovery process that goes along with that. Well, Klingberg has now finally reached the point where he's pushed his recovery as far as he can. Now he needs to step it up and take it to the next level, and that's skating in the National Hockey League. And needless to say, there'd be a number of teams that are interested in the services of the veteran defenseman. I include the Toronto Maple Leafs, so why wouldn't he consider going back to the Leafs? Not that the Leafs have room on that blue line, Gino. There would have to be some sort of move made by Brad Treliving, but there's been a good relationship that's been ongoing there. I know that the Ottawa Senators have explored some interest. The Edmonton Oilers blue line has been a question mark all season long, so no doubt that Stan Bowman is in this game. And I think really what was a longer list has now been narrowed down to roughly 5 to 7 teams. So the expectation is that Klingberg and his representatives, Craig Oster and Newport Sports, will continue to have dialogue with these clubs, and a decision should be made on the resumption of his NHL career in the next couple of weeks.
Certainly wish him all the best. Now, speaking of injuries, when the Four Nations rosters were announced at the start of December, the management teams gave the bubble guys a heads up that they might get the call if guys got hurt. Are we starting to hear some chatter on that front, Dregs?
We are, and look, from a Team Canada perspective, knock on wood for any Canadian hockey fan, there's not a lot of injury to be overly concerned with, but that's what the management group of Team Canada is focused on. What does that list look like up front, on defense, in goal if somebody goes down? Now, the Americans have a bit more concern, just a little bit more, and that's, of course, the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Auston Matthews. He's played well since his return from the latest aggravation. I know that Team USA General Manager Billy Guerin, General Manager of the Minnesota Wild, is in constant communication, keeping close tabs on what's going on with Auston Matthews. But as Brad Treliving of the Toronto Maple Leafs expressed on Monday, there's no real concern there, and there's no real timeline aside from the fact that we're inside a month now from the start of the Four Nations in Montreal and in Boston. So literally it's a day by day. And the assumption is that, assuming that Auston Matthews doesn't aggravate his issue again, that he will play for Team USA in the Four Nations. And then I shift over to the Ottawa Senators, and maybe a more concerning issue there for Team Sweden, and that's in Linus Ullmark. We know, Gino, that he's been on the ice, but he has yet to practice with the main group. Now, the Swedes are in good hands from a goaltending perspective. They've got Gustafsson, they've got Jacob Markstrom there, but they'd like to bring Linus Ullmark along for the ride, provided he's healthy. So really, it's just a day-by-day monitoring process for all the management groups of the 4 teams at the Four Nations.
Dregs, there's an interesting angle to all of this. As you mentioned, puck drop to Four Nations is now less than a month away. The trade deadline is just over 7 weeks away. How do you think the tournament might affect the way general managers handle the trade deadline?
Yeah, well, I haven't polled all 32 GMs, but I have spoke to a number of them, and more than a few have suggested that they're looking at the Four Nations as really a soft deadline, if you will. And I think when we look at the critical dates of the NHL calendar, there are 2 obvious deadlines in season. One is the holiday roster freeze. We've come through that. There was a flurry of activity around that one. And then obviously the next one would be March 7th, and that is the firm NHL trade deadline, which expires 3 p.m. Eastern on the 7th of March. But some GMs are looking at the start of the Four Nations and saying, hey, I'd like to get my business done before that tournament gets underway and there's at least a short pause in the National Hockey League. And, you know, there's been some media speculation around the league as to whether or not you can actually make a trade during the Four Nations, and you can. There are no restrictions around that. And surprise to me anyway, Gino, the League and the Players Association actually didn't even give it any consideration as to whether or not they needed to create some sort of stop or block or restriction around player movement or trade activity. So it depends on the GM that you talk to, but some look at the Four Nations as a bit of a bump. You know, let's get going. Let's get some trade activity before the Four Nation gets underway.
Can you imagine getting dealt while you're playing at that tournament? A bit of a distraction. Listen, we're all still keeping an eye on the Canucks, and yeah, no kidding. We're all keeping an eye on what the Canucks are going to do with Miller and Pettersson. What are you hearing out of Vancouver and the impact the situation could have on other potential moves?
Well, look, I'm going to jinx myself by saying it's quiet on all fronts, because normally when I say that, something significant happens or there's some activity around the National Hockey League. But quiet isn't a bad thing for the Vancouver Canucks, because that means that, you know, the focus is on where it needs to be, and that's on the ice and winning hockey games. And as we witnessed on Saturday night against the Toronto Maple Leafs, things are trending well for the Vancouver Canucks. But all the speculation around JT Miller and Elias Pettersson has had some influence on the overall trade market. But I think there are a number of factors, at least three anyway, that contribute to why it might be quiet right now. Look through the Eastern Conference, Gino. Well, look across the National Hockey League, and we see again a glaring example of the parity that exists in the NHL in the regular season. I mean, there's literally a log jam for a wild card spot, a playoff spot in the East. So that has an influence in defining who is a seller and who is a buyer. And then you've got those who might be projected as a seller looking at what's going on in Vancouver. Well, if JT Miller is willing to waive his no move clause, and there's no guarantee that he'll be willing to do that, he hasn't been asked to do that yet, you know, and he goes somewhere, what is the return? How does that impact the trade market? Or a Pettersson, as an example. They get moved. The piece is coming back to Vancouver. How does that influence? There's always a layering process when it comes to big trades. And there are some out there, at least in the category of the seller, that are waiting to see what, if anything, happens first in Vancouver.
Gives us lots to talk about, my friend. That's the early version of Insider Trading. The full version with Dreg, CJ, and Pierre is coming up later on SportsCenter.